Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Exurbia Now, the Battleground of American Democracy, by David Masciotra. Narrated by Lee Goettl. We are half-tamed creatures, whose great moral task it is to hold in balance the angel and the monster within, for we are both, and to ignore this duality is to invite disaster. Gore Vidal, 1959. Born in a small town. An introduction. The most important battles are fought in places no one cares about, James Lee Burke often writes. Dave Robichaux is the recurring hero of Burke's crime novels. A former New Orleans cop and Vietnam vet, he is a detective working for the New Iberia Sheriff's Department who fights to protect the natural environment against avaricious polluters and preserve the dignity of children against sexual predators, and help move America in the direction of democratic idealism and virtue. Transforming his relatively small role into a crusade for justice, he becomes a veritable foot soldier in the war on behalf of a multicultural, multiracial, and ecumenical democracy against bigots and bullies who bedevil New Iberia, Louisiana, a town few care about. Burke's fictional universe bears a strong resemblance to our own fragile world. New Iberia is a political and cultural cousin of towns across America, particularly those that surround me in the Midwest, those with stories that feature throughout this book. Towns that, indeed, few people care about, but where our democracy's most important battles are taking place. There are battles for racial justice, as white flight has moved from suburbia to Exurbia, a densely populated precinct, not quite rural, but far from urban. Exurbia, as its name would suggest, is excised from the urban center, further from the suburbs than metropolitan culture and commerce with fewer people. Although it is not monolithic, it has developed as the later stage of suburbia, blending the politics of escape, primarily in the form of white flight, with the economics of corporate homogeneity. Once the land of trailer parks, it is now full of planned communities, new single-family homes in close proximity to wide roads, big-box retailers, chain restaurants, and megachurches. Most exurbs lack a downtown, walkable commercial district, and many even have a noticeable absence of sidewalks. It is where Americans go to bowl alone, as Robert Putnam would have it, or to paraphrase the late Warren Zevon, enjoy their splendid isolation. Where civic association and communal culture die, right-wing movements metastasize. It should not register as surprise, then, that Exurbia is now the staging and breeding ground for the radical right extremist insurgency troubling the United States by threatening its citizenry and endangering its democracy. A simple reading of an electoral map makes as clear as red and blue crayons that Donald Trump's popularity scales off the charts in Exurbia, and that the most malevolent and fascistic members of Congress, from Georgia's Marjorie Taylor Greene to Ohio's Jim Jordan, represent districts that are heavily exurban. Their voters do not want disturbances to their isolation in the form of racial diversity, LGBTQ acceptance, and decisions rendered according to the constitutional mechanisms of secular democratic governance. They seek an America like the communities that they create and dominate, hostile to outsiders and the public good, ruled by white, Christian authority, and operative in conjunction with the romanticized mores of the pre-civil rights, pre-feminist, pre-gay rights 1950s. It is because of anxiety, hatred, and hostility toward democracy that the rank and file in the January 6th insurrectionist mob was populated heavily with residents of exurban towns. The right-wing voters placing the United States on the edge of violent tyranny are not the only players in the story. They are reactionary, but also reactive. Exurbia grew as a means to escape not only the big city, but the increasingly liberal suburbs surrounding the cities. As suburbia becomes more diverse, progressive, and cosmopolitan, exurbanites' knuckles grow ever wider, clutching onto their power and paranoia. Something's happening in the backwoods. It's spreading out like water. Stone-cold rage in the hinterland. Government Mule declares in their protest song following the political ascension of Donald Trump. It was not the metropolitan areas, but the exurbs and rural villages that acted as a collective valet of Trump into the White House. The states of the industrial Midwest, for decades reliable territory for the Democratic Party, shifted to the right because of a tilt in suburbs and exurbs where beleaguered residents sought a strongman to assuage their fears, and, tapping into a multi-century tradition of xenophobia and racism, their perception of a threat emanating out of the rapidly diversifying demography of America. Political forecasters and prognosticators appear in agreement that the genuinely swing territory of states like Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Arizona is not the solidly Democratic city centers, or the blood-red rural ground, but the suburbs, some poor, some rich, some a stone's throw from the city, and some only marginally attached to urban energy and commercial activity. The shift of merely a few points toward Democrats in the suburbs was crucial to Joe Biden's 2020 victory. In a violent attempt to nullify the votes of the 81 million Americans responsible for the Biden presidency, an insurrectionist insurgency, comprising largely enraged white men from small metro suburbs and exurbs, stormed the Capitol, where they defecated on the floor, attacked police officers, and threatened to lynch public officials, hoping to stop the certification of the election. Similar to when two armies converged at Gettysburg, or a young minister named Martin Luther King organized a boycott of public transit in Montgomery, Alabama, suddenly many people are deeply worried, anxious, and excited about what transpires in places no one used to care about. The right-wing states of most exurban and some suburban counties make them convenient debate fodder whenever the national discussion turns to red and blue states. But the consequences are much greater than election results, which typically receive the breathless and often superficial coverage of competition in professional sports. Exurbia is no longer the setting of an intriguing subplot in American history. Because it is the recruiting and staging area for the extreme right, it is the battleground of American democracy. Exurbia now, the battleground of American democracy, will give an impressionistic sense of what it is like to live in one part of the Midwest where suburbia and exurbia meet, intermingle, and often collide. It provides a sense of the fight for democracy on the ground, in the heartland, and how suburbia is changing and exurbia is becoming radically right-wing in response. In the shadow of Chicago and stretching into the pastoral villages of Indiana, the geography of Exurbia now illustrates the erosion, shifting terrain, and fertility of an American democracy that is both beleaguered and yet still full of promise. The stories, arguments, and observations that fill Exurbia now derive from a writer in a unique position to offer a powerful chronicle. I combine over 10 years of journalism and familiarity with academic research into American voting patterns and political alignments with the education of my own life. I came of age in the Chicago suburbs, live in northwest Indiana, and have come to possess a degree of intimacy with the people and places I describe. A drive through my part of the vast American landscape corrects many of the misperceptions that inhibit political comprehension and conversation. The average Trump supporter, for example, is not a hobo of globalization, merely angry at trade deals and political correctness. The reality is much more insidious. The average small town is not a backwater full of only prejudice and parochial judgment. The reality is much more inspiring. There are many Americans who do not neatly fall into the increasingly narrow and stereotypical classifications of politics and identity. I am one. My home is in a small town in Indiana, and yet my politics are firmly on the left. My ideology finds traffic with most metropolitan progressives to the extent that one of my most reliable sources of amusement is the hate mail I receive from angry readers who accuse me of membership in the dubious category coastal elite. Most of the political allies that I find live in Chicago or another large urban area. But I prefer to reside in a small town. Once, when interviewing Bill Ayers, the anti-war activist, educator, and once leading member of the Weather Underground, who briefly became famous in 2008 when Sarah Palin called him a terrorist, he asked where I live. When I answered, he looked at me incredulously and asked, why? The brilliance and eloquence I managed to muster amounted to the simple declaration, I like it. Ayers took a sip of his coffee. It is not as if I live in a town not yet discovered by anthropologists. It takes a mere 40 minutes by car or train to get to Chicago from my home. My wife Sarah and I often visit Art Institute, shop at bookstores, dine out, and attend concerts in jazz clubs and the beautiful Chicago Theater. We are also supporters and volunteers with the Rainbow Push Coalition, the international civil rights and humanitarian organization founded by Jesse Jackson with its headquarters on the south side of Chicago. I am an overjoyed visitor of Chicago, but I do not want to live in Chicago. My friend, the novelist Tim Hall, once said that every person has an ecosystem in which they thrive. Born and raised in New York City, when he and his wife moved to a tiny town in Illinois, he felt like he was quarantined in a padded cell. He needs the lights, energy, activity, large crowds, and fast pace of the city. When Sarah and I file out of the Riviera Theater, exit the Art Institute, or pay the tab at Harry Carey's restaurant, I am ready to retreat back to the empty side streets, 2-block downtown, and slow movement of our little village where I can see dogs in big yards and children playing in the middle of the road, and when I'm in a solitary mood, can walk outside on a route that enables me to avoid human interaction. It is something of a ritual in our home for Sarah to ask, "Why do we live here?" her voice bending on notes of bafflement and distress. What is wrong with people around here? She sees the pickup trucks with NRA bumper stickers, Blue Lives Matter decals, and large flags flying from the back of the bed. If that sounds too cliched to be true, come over for dinner some night. I once saw a truck with 2 stickers, side by side, apparently without a hint of cognitive dissonance, "God bless our troops, especially our snipers," and "Jesus protects me." At the height of hostility in the 2016 presidential race, a neighboring town made local news when a bar owner advertised on her business sign, yes, the owner was a woman, "Grab 'em by the pussy, buckets of beer on special." The Chamber of Commerce, along with a petition of nearby residents, pressured her to censor the sign, which she did, but only after protesting that free speech was under assault by the politically correct. It is often irritating to observe the pride and right-wing ignorance that is visible in provincial America, but that is not the entire story, and it is not the totality of my experience. It is a delight to take a leisurely walk into town, stop for a cup of vanilla custard at the family-run dairy stand, or an espresso at the coffee house, always playing the Grateful Dead, while students from the local high school buzz around taking customers' orders, and then buy locally sourced honey from the eccentric chain smoker in high heels who owns a hodgepodge shop next door. I check a book out of the library, while the elderly clerk stocks the shelves and children in costume run into the back room for a theme party. The waitress at the bar and grill down the road knows my wife's and my drink order before we even lower ourselves into a booth. The restaurant borders a bakery, where its Buddhist owner has created an outdoor home for a few stray cats, who sleep under its heated roof and eat out of the bowls of dry food. Throughout the main street, there are hand-painted murals decorating the buildings, the artwork of local painters and high school art students. We can also see advertisements for spaghetti dinners and pancake breakfasts benefiting low-income families, and cancer patients unable to keep up with their medical expenses, a reminder of both the ghastly injustices of American society and the generosity of the human spirit. Small towns have the reputation of translucent whiteness, a population so pale that an onlooker might require shades to walk down the street. But our neighbors include a couple who moved from Nigeria, an Illinois implant who married a Japanese immigrant, and a Colombian-born American. In our small neighborhood, there are young couples, elderly widows, and residents of various sexual orientations, political loyalties, and religious beliefs. There are bodybuilders, BMX riders, musicians, and drunkards. Just as the right wing lies that the real America exists only in towns like the one where I live, it exists everywhere and anywhere that is America, from Big Sky to the big city, liberals too often erroneously assert that the country's great diversity is only accessible in large cities, or that small towns are not part of progressive America. The reality is that small towns have become ground zero for many of the nation's most urgent crises and severe troubles. The Brookings Institute has reported on the changing geography of poverty, indicating that, in the words of a Slate headline, the suburbs are now where poverty lives. Suburban and exurban sprawl has long initiated and illustrated that environmental devastation of U.S. policy, creating neighborhoods that are unwalkable, prioritizing automobiles over people, increasing pollution, and contributing to the existential threat of climate change. The fight for healthy and locally sourced food, products of sustainable agricultural practices, often begins in small towns where farmers live and work the land. As progressives celebrate the multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism of major metropolitan areas, they should consider that the fight for racial equality and the acceptance of LGBTQ Americans is at its most impactful in small towns, where racial minorities often have a tougher time receiving hospitality from their neighbors, and a young gay boy or trans girl is more likely to have come out to a conservative family. Following the election of Donald Trump, the major newspapers and cable news networks were breathless in their coverage of the Trump voter, creating profiles that were so repetitive that one can almost write them according to memory, recycling cliched phrases and common images of white working-class privation. The unemployed factory worker stares pensively out of the living room window of a dilapidated rental home, taking slow drags off his cigarette, before explaining how the town slid into economic decline when the textile mill boarded its doors. His story is important, but where was the segment on the young Hillary Clinton voter in Youngstown, Ohio, barely able to make student debt payments and concerned about her uninsured mother ailing from a stroke? Where was the story of the Indiana for Biden volunteer in 2020 who called my home to confirm that my wife and I were going to make it to the polls? Where was the coverage of the activists who have toiled for decades, without profit or fame, to prevent their towns from falling under the manipulative spell of right-wing propaganda and scapegoating by working to engineer class solidarity that transcends racial difference and religious divide? The story that is lost in the transformation of suburbia and the traumas and triumphs of the small town is the power, persistence, and often mere presence of the small-town liberal, the inhabitant of provincial America who believes in equality, celebrates diversity, and enrolls in movements for justice. By creating a false dichotomy of urban versus rural and suburban, the mainline media amplified the divisive stereotypes of the effete elite in a high-rise of Chicago chortling at the troubles of the hick-down state, who keeps his assault rifle safely underneath a Confederate flag in the garage. While these unfortunate characters do populate American cities and villages, they are not wholly representative. There are right-wing racists and homophobic theocrats in Manhattan, and there are acolytes of Jesse Jackson, Harvey Milk, and Dolores Huerta in suburban courthouses and agrarian classrooms. They have stories that are essential to the navigation of America's political and spiritual geography. The war for the American future, as James Lee Burke would appreciate, is happening in places few people care about. One side is gathering forces and arms in the exurbs, and another is organizing in the cities and moving to the suburbs. Causalities, and ultimate tragedy of warfare, are inevitable. The battlefields are the towns and counties like mine, but the fallout zone stretches all the way around the world. I was born in a small town, John Mellencamp sings in the opening line of his famous song about his hometown of Seymour, Indiana. Growing up in a region with the nickname Kentuckiana, Mellencamp became one of rock and roll's greatest songwriters and a co-founder of Farm Aid, a yearly benefit concert for American farmers. Mellencamp's songs, often dealing with the blight of racism, war, and abuse of the poor on America's political ecology, provide not only entertainment, but also illustrate the inspiring fusion that is possible between art and activism. "I'm a blue guy in a red state," the music legend told me when I met him in his recording studio in Nashville, Indiana, a town with a barn dance as one of its entertainment venues. One of the neighbors of Mellencamp's artistic headquarters was an old man in bib overalls reading the Bible on the front porch. "I like having the opportunity," the songwriter and painter continued, "to communicate with people who don't hold my political beliefs. When he was on VH1 Storytellers, a program that encouraged songwriters to give lengthy spoken word introductions to their most popular songs, he argued that what resonated with his audience with Small Town was the truth of the song. "All I did was look out my window and sing what I saw," he said, before belting out, in his signature rasp, lines like, "I cannot forget from where it is that I come from. I cannot forget the people who really love me." Mellencamp believes that, in this instance, the truth made people feel good about themselves. Other times, he explained, "I've written songs that told the truth and people have said, 'Man, why are you being so negative?' No, that's not negative. That's just the truth that you don't want to hear." I first heard the truth of Mellencamp's music as a 13-year-old boy while I was playing basketball in the driveway at a friend's house. We pretended we were in the starting lineup of the Chicago Bulls, alongside Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, when my friend's older brother walked into the garage, began working under the hood of his car, and inserted a cassette into a boombox. When the power chords registered in my adrenaline glands, I rushed over to ask what he was playing. Looking irritated at my existence, he handed me the cassette case. John Cougar, American Fool. That was my entrance into the wonderful emporium of rock and roll. It was my introduction to art. It was an early glimpse into a universe of liberal politics with its topography of justice and its cartography of hope. It was all the unpredictable result of one small-town rebel, one pastoral progressive, looking out his window and summoning all his creativity, compassion, and eloquence to describe what he saw. And so begins this book. Welcome to The Exit, a suburban exurban tour. The United States of America promised an escape from reality. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, the protection of two oceans, the bounty of natural resources, the exploitation of cheap labor, and a myth-making machine that would flush the cheeks of Lewis Carroll allowed Americans to live in the perpetual fantasy of eternal youth and endless wealth. American exceptionalism, the fraught and destructive update of Manifest Destiny, which postulates the United States as an indispensable nation, different and superior to the dispensable, emanates out of the delusional essence of the American experience. Like two of America's most fantastical creations, Hollywood and Disney, so too does the American dream spring out of the amber waves of grain. Like a drunk stumbling into an insight, the phrase American dream includes a certain admirable honesty. Dreams are unreal. They can possess great beauty, as much of the American dream does, especially for the countless immigrants from countless nations who risked life and limb for freedom and opportunity awaiting them on American shores. They can also turn to nightmares. In the American dream, suburbia is the deep REM sleep stage of the dream. If the United States offers an escape from reality, suburbia, up until recently, always offered an escape from the escape. It is the fantasy of endless growth taken to its most vivid and pornographic. Suburbia, like any fantasy featuring the Freudian synthesis of fears and wishes, occupies a bipolar identity in American culture. Politicians and parents romanticize it, promising that in the suburbs the family is free to thrive and children are free from crime, drugs, and danger. Filmmakers, songwriters, novelists, and painters have explored its dark side, transforming the substance of dreams into the material of night terrors. From Sinclair Lewis's Main Street to David Lynch's Blue Velvet, the suburbs threaten to stupefy and horrify. The irony is that for millions of Americans across generations, including me, suburbia was the home of, to paraphrase the title of the most famous movie set in a small town, A Wonderful Life. In the United States, whether it was true or not, mediocre political leaders convinced the middle class in the second half of the 20th century that famine, war, genocide, oppression, and extreme poverty were the plot twists of melodramatic tales that took place in history books or countries far away without any connection to life in the land of the free. The suburbs offered a localized domestic version of the escapist dream. Crime, gun violence, deprivation, drug addiction, environmental degradation, infrastructural decay, and racial discord were problems for big city mayors and police departments to handle. They could not and would not invade the suburban fortress. When Donald Trump lit rabid crowds on fire with his nativist, hateful, and imbecilic chant, "Build the Wall," his suburban and exurban base of voters reacted with excitement. He was speaking their language. For decades, they had resided in American territory they believed would forever enjoy the protection of walls institutional, ideological, and imaginary. When defining and describing suburbia and exurbia, and making a distinction between the two related but not identical terms and places, it is necessary to distinguish what suburbia was from what it has become. There are suburbs everywhere in the developed world, but in the United States, they took on a unique character in congruence with the unique dynamics of American culture and economics, namely racial segregation and the prioritization of the automobile as the organizing principle of city planning and familial life. Following the Second World War, it became not only possible but popular to construct communities dozens of miles away from men's job sites and the elements that surrounded those job sites: traffic, pollution, nightlife decadence, and racial minorities. When my grandfather returned home from World War II, he used a GI loan to purchase a home in the town where he grew up, Thornton, Illinois. Thornton, about 20 miles outside of Chicago, became a working and middle-class suburb. Its bankability rested on its proximity to the freeway and also its even closer proximity to the Material Service Quarry, a profitable limestone extraction operation that provided stable, high-wage union employment to thousands of workers, including my grandfather. He and my grandmother would have one child, my mother, Pearl. Like many residents of Thornton, my grandparents were first-generation Americans, the children of Serbian immigrants. Their beige-colored skin was passed down to my mother. Even though her racial category was white, her appearance as a young girl was brown. There were no black or Latino families in Thornton, so, in the absence of the real targets of their hatred, the neighborhood bigots began throwing rocks and hurling anti-black racial epithets at my mother during her morning walks to school. The harassment persisted for years, and the implications of my mother's childhood resound in the study of recent American history. Her experience is emblematic of the dominant trends of the late 20th century. One of the great ironies of American politics is that suburban voters are typically more conservative than their urban compatriots, and yet the suburbs exist only because of big government spending. My grandfather nearly died in an effort to save civilization from fascism. It isn't as if he did not earn his compensation. The fact remains, however, that he, like millions of other American veterans, helped to build and populate the suburban middle class with the indispensable aid of government subsidy. The staggering amount of young men who entered the real estate market following the Second World War, armed with GI loans, led to a massive boom in property development and housing. From the famous Levittown development of Long Island to the bedroom communities surrounding Detroit, real estate magnates took advantage of escalating demand for family homes and public funding by creating the suburbs. Whether they were applying at the Material Service Quarry in Thornton, the steel mills of nearby Gary, Indiana, or the automobile plants in Detroit, young men found almost boundless opportunity for backbreaking but secure work with handsome benefits. The victories of organized labor coalesced with additional government subsidy to make suburban living and family rearing ideal. In 1956, President Dwight Eisenhower, himself a World War II veteran, signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, fully funding the establishment and maintenance of interstate expressways. The expansion of freeways functioned as a jackpot for automobile companies and construction firms. It also enhanced an already prosperous real estate market. Better and bigger highways translate into safer and easier commutes. The suburban middle class was the largest and most successful big government program in the history of the United States. Economists have an anemic term, negative externalities, which in direct English means consequences. The consequences of the creation of the suburban middle class were smog, the explosion of fossil fuels, the trigger of white fear and resentment as a national political force, and the degradation of communal and civic life through the encouragement of neighborhood isolation and individualistic car culture. Another consequence involves government and taxpayer largesse. When someone receives, someone else does not. Cheryl Cashin, Georgetown law professor, refers to the mechanisms of the multi-decade exclusion of blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans from
Sample complete. Ready to continue?